The smell of his cologne still lingered in the grand hallway, a faint, dignified ghost of sandalwood and sweet pipe tobacco, but Aunt Beatrice was already ripping the custom silk drapes down in the drawing room. My grandfather's body hadn't even been transported to the morgue yet. He was still upstairs, the paramedics having just zipped the heavy black transport bag shut. The cold, mechanical rasp of that zipper was still echoing in my skull like a gunshot, over and over again. Yet here was my family, swarming the massive foyer of the estate like starved locusts hitting a drought-stricken wheat field. Uncle Richard was on his cell phone, aggressively pacing the antique Persian rug, his voice booming as he loudly asked his broker what the tax penalty was for liquidating a diverse blue-chip stock portfolio. My cousin, Chloe, had literally stepped over my grandfather's distressed, whining golden retriever to rip an authentic Ming Dynasty vase off its mahogany pedestal, turning it over with manic energy to check the appraisal hallmark on the bottom. I stood frozen on the bottom step of the grand staircase, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip the polished banister to keep from collapsing. I was drowning in a suffocating, paralyzing grief, my chest caved in by the realization that the only person in this world who ever truly loved me was gone forever. And all around me, the people who shared my blood were vibrating with a sickening, barely concealed euphoria. To them, a beloved patriarch hadn't just died. A massive, multi-million-dollar lottery ticket had just paid out. To understand the sheer, grotesque depravity of this moment, you have to understand the ecosystem we had been living in for the past 2 decades. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, was a titan of industry in his prime. He had built an empire in logistics and manufacturing, selling outright before the turn of the millennium for a sum of money that essentially guaranteed generational wealth for a century, provided the generations that followed weren't complete idiots. Unfortunately for the Sterling legacy, idiocy was the defining trait of his immediate offspring. I am Eleanor. I am the daughter of Arthur's youngest son, a man who passed away in a car accident when I was barely a toddler, followed shortly by my mother, who succumbed to a long, brutal battle with illness when I was 7. From that moment on, Arthur Sterling took me in. I didn't just visit the sprawling, ivy-covered stone manor on the hill, I lived there. I grew up in its massive library, sliding across the hardwood floors in my socks, losing myself in encyclopedias and blueprints. And more importantly, I grew up in his workshop. While my grandfather had built his fortune in the loud, chaotic world of global shipping, his true passion, his sanctuary, was horology, the study and measurement of time, specifically the restoration of antique mechanical clocks and watches. The workshop was a converted greenhouse at the back of the property, smelling permanently of brass polish, machine oil, aged wood, and that sharp, metallic tang of ozone. It was a place of extreme precision and quiet patience. The world out there, Ellie, he used to tell me, his calloused, massive hands delicately maneuvering a pair of microscopic tweezers to place a ruby jewel bearing into a pocket watch movement, is loud. It is chaotic, and it is largely entirely out of our control. People will scream, markets will crash, ships will sink. But in here, if you put the right gear in the right place, if you balance the escapement just perfectly, the universe makes sense. It ticks, it beats, it lives. I was a quiet, nerdy kid. I wore oversized flannel shirts, had perpetually messy hair that I tied back with whatever rubber band I could find, and I had absolutely zero interest in the elite, country club lifestyle that the Sterling name afforded. I didn't want debutante balls or designer handbags. I wanted to sit beside Arthur, wearing a magnifying loupe strapped to my head, learning how to clean a mainspring barrel without letting the coiled steel snap back and slice my fingers to the bone. We spent thousands of hours in that greenhouse. He taught me the difference between a tourbillon and a carousel, how to lathe custom brass fittings for clocks whose original parts hadn't been manufactured since the 1800s. We worked in a comfortable, companionable silence, accompanied only by the rhythmic, overlapping ticking of hundreds of clocks lining the walls, and the soft strains of Vivaldi playing from a paint-splattered radio. I loved him with an intensity that defied language. He wasn't just my guardian, he was my mentor, my father figure, my anchor to the world. We didn't care about his money, we cared about the time we spent together. But the rest of the family? They cared about nothing but the money. Arthur had two other surviving children, my Aunt Beatrice and my Uncle Richard. If my grandfather was a testament to hard work and stoic grace, Beatrice and Richard were monuments to entitlement and profound, staggering incompetence. Aunt Beatrice was a socialite whose primary occupation seemed to be aggressively networking at charity galas she never actually donated to. She had married a weak-willed plastic surgeon, drained his accounts to fund a series of increasingly bizarre wellness businesses, including a crystal healing spa that went bankrupt in 6 months, and divorced him. She lived entirely on a massive allowance my grandfather provided, though she constantly complained it wasn't enough to maintain a lifestyle fitting the sterling legacy. Uncle Richard, on the other hand, fancied himself a rogue financial genius. He was a man perpetually one bad investment away from being a billionaire, or so he claimed. He spoke entirely in buzzwords: synergy, disrupting the market, blockchain paradigms. In reality, he was a gullible mark who sank millions of grandfather's capital into vaporware tech startups, ill-advised real estate flips in terrible neighborhoods, and, on one memorable occasion, an alpaca farm in Peru that turned out to be a complete Ponzi scheme. And then there was Chloe, Aunt Beatrice's only daughter, my cousin, and the undisputed golden child of her own delusional narrative. Chloe was 3 years older than me and had made a career out of being aesthetically pleasing on Instagram. She had zero marketable skills, a closet full of clothes that cost more than most people's mortgages, and a personality that possessed all the depth and warmth of a spilled puddle of iced latte. The dynamic was established early and maintained with vicious consistency. They were the true Sterlings, destined for greatness, temporarily inconvenienced by my grandfather's annoying habit of continuing to breathe. I was the pathetic, orphan charity case, the weird, grease-stained gremlin who hid in the backyard playing with rusty gears. The emotional abuse wasn't a slow burn, it was a constant, radiating heat. I vividly remember a Thanksgiving dinner a few years ago. It was one of the mandatory family gatherings Arthur insisted upon, hoping against all empirical evidence that his family might one day act like one. The dining room table was a massive expanse of polished mahogany, groaning under the weight of a catered feast. I was 19 at the time, home from my second year of mechanical engineering classes at the State University. I was wearing a simple, comfortable gray sweater and jeans. Chloe sat across from me, dripping in Cartier and wearing a silk dress that looked like a stiff breeze would violate multiple indecency laws. "So, Ellie," Chloe drawled, swirling her wine glass, her manicured nails tapping against the crystal. "Still playing with screwdrivers and grease? Have you managed to find a boyfriend yet, or do you just date the lawnmowers?" Aunt Beatrice let out a high, tittering laugh, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "Oh, Chloe, don't tease her. Ellie has a very unique spirit. Not everyone is cut out for high society. Although, Ellie dear, if you ever want to borrow one of Chloe's old dresses, I'm sure we could have it taken in. You look so frightfully drab, darling. It reflects poorly on the house staff when you answer the door looking like a mechanic." I kept my eyes glued to my mashed potatoes, my cheeks burning. I had learned a long time ago that engaging with them only gave them ammunition. "I'm fine, Aunt Beatrice, thank you. My engineering program keeps me pretty busy." "Engineering?" Uncle Richard scoffed from the end of the table, cutting his prime rib with aggressive, sawing motions. "A blue-collar mindset, Arthur. That's what you're fostering in the girl. A total waste of the sterling name. Now, speaking of engineering, Dad, I wanted to circle back to that pitch I sent you, the algorithmic day trading app. The developers are ready to go to beta. I just need a bridge loan of about 400 grand to clear the server costs." My grandfather, sitting at the head of the table, slowly placed his heavy silver fork down. His face was a mask of deeply weathered stone. He had sharp, intelligent blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He looked at Richard, then he looked at Beatrice, then he looked at Chloe. Finally, his eyes rested on me. There was a whole conversation in that single glance. "I see them, Ellie," his eyes said. "I see exactly what they are." "Richard," my grandfather said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that instantly silenced the room. "I told you last week. I am not funding another app. The last time I gave you money for technology, You bought $200,000 worth of servers that are currently rusting in a warehouse in New Jersey because you forgot to hire anyone who knew how to code. Richard flushed a deep, ugly crimson. That was a pivot, Dad. The market shifted. If you would just trust my vision. I trust my bank statements, Richard, Arthur interrupted calmly. And they tell a very consistent story of your vision. No. Beatrice huffed, throwing her napkin onto her plate. Really, Arthur, there's no need to be so stingy. You have more money than God, and you sit in this dusty old house hoarding it while your own children struggle. It's unnatural. She paused, her eyes raking over the ornate crown molding of the dining room. Besides, it's not like you can take it with you. I was telling my interior designer just yesterday, this room is going to need a total gut job when. Well, eventually. The wood paneling is terribly depressing. We're going to paint it all a bright, airy white. She was measuring the drapes. She was literally planning the renovation of his house while he was sitting right there, eating his turkey. I felt a surge of hot, blinding anger. Aunt Beatrice, that's a horrible thing to say. Chloe scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, shut up, Ellie. Don't play the saint. We all know why you suck up to the old man, spending all your time in that filthy shed with him. You're just trying to secure your place in the will. It's pathetic. You're the orphan cousin. You'll get a pat on the head and a trust fund for community college, and the actual bloodline will handle the estate. So drop the act. I opened my mouth to shout back, but a heavy hand rested on my shoulder. It was Arthur. He had stood up, his tall frame still imposing despite his 80 years. Dinner, Arthur announced, his voice devoid of all warmth, is over. They grumbled, they complained, but they left. They always left when the ATM shut its doors for the night. Later that evening, I found Arthur out in the greenhouse. He was sitting at his workbench, staring blankly at the disassembled pieces of a French carriage clock. The only sound was the furious beating of rain against the glass roof. I pulled up my stool beside him, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the dinner. I'm sorry, Grandpa, I whispered. I shouldn't have said anything. I just hate the way they talk to you. Arthur sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of a century. He didn't look at me, keeping his eyes on the tiny brass gears scattered across his velvet mat. You have nothing to apologize for, Ellie, he said softly. You have a good heart, a loyal heart. It's a rare commodity in this family. Why do you let them do it? I asked, the frustration finally boiling over. Why do you keep paying for Aunt Beatrice's lifestyle? Why do you keep bailing Uncle Richard out of his debts? They don't love you, Grandpa, they just want what you have. It makes me sick. He picked up a small gear with his tweezers, holding it up to the harsh light of his desk lamp. Do you know what this is, Ellie? It's a third wheel from the gear train, I answered automatically. Yes, look closely at the teeth. What do you see? I leaned in. They're worn down, uneven, the metal has degraded. Exactly, he murmured. If I put this wheel back into the clock, what will happen? It will jam, I said. The friction will be wrong. It will strip the teeth off the center wheel, and eventually, the entire movement will seize up and destroy itself. Arthur lowered the tweezers, placing the defective gear into a small scrap bin. My children, Ellie, are defective gears. I raised them with every advantage, every opportunity, but somewhere along the line, the metal warped. They became consumed by greed, by status, by the illusion of wealth rather than the substance of it. He finally turned to look at me, his blue eyes piercing. I give them just enough rope to hang themselves, Ellie. I fund their lives because the alternative is watching my own flesh and blood starve in the gutter, and despite my better judgment, I am not that cruel. But I am not blind. I know exactly what happens the moment my heart stops beating. They are vultures circling a dying animal. Don't talk like that, I pleaded, tears stinging my eyes. You're not dying. You're going to live to be 100. He offered a sad, gentle smile, reaching out to pat my grease-stained hand. I am a realist, kiddo. The mainspring winds down for all of us eventually. But I promise you this. His grip on my hand tightened, becoming surprisingly fierce. When the time comes, they will not get what they think they are getting. I have spent my entire life building an empire, and I refuse to let it be dismantled by fools. Time is the ultimate truth-teller, Ellie. It reveals exactly what people are made of. And when the clock strikes midnight on my life, the true test begins. He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't push him. I was just relieved the tension had broken. We went back to work, the silence returning to normal, just the ticking of the clocks and the steady patter of the rain. I thought we had years left. I thought we had a decade. We had exactly 14 months. It happened on a Tuesday. The cruelty of the universe is often mundane. There was no grand, dramatic preamble. I was at my apartment near the university, studying for a fluid dynamics midterm, my phone buzzing on the desk. It was Maria, the estate's head housekeeper. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Eleanor, Ellie, you need to come. Now, it's Mr. Arthur. He collapsed in the greenhouse. The ambulance is here, but, she broke off into a sob, please just hurry. I don't remember the drive. I remember running red lights. I remember the screaming of sirens in my own head. When I skidded my beat-up Honda Civic onto the gravel driveway of the estate, the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance cast horrific, strobing shadows against the stone walls of the house. I bolted out of the car, sprinting up the steps, bursting through the massive front doors. "Grandpa!" I screamed, my voice cracking, tearing at my throat. A paramedic stepped out of the drawing room. He looked at me, taking in my panicked, tear-streaked face. The look of professional pity in his eyes was the absolute worst thing I have ever seen. It was the look that told me I was too late. "I'm sorry, miss," he said quietly. "A massive myocardial infarction. It was very sudden, he didn't suffer." My knees simply stopped working. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the foyer, the air violently expelled from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world narrowed down to a single, agonizing point of absolute loss. He was gone. The man who taught me how to read time, how to fix broken things, how to be quiet and steady in a loud world. He was just gone. I don't know how long I sat there, curled in a ball on the floor, weeping until I was dry heaving. I was vaguely aware of Maria kneeling beside me, stroking my hair, crying with me. And then, the front doors blew open again. Aunt Beatrice rushed in, flanked by Uncle Richard and Chloe. For a brief, naive second, I thought they were rushing in with the same panic I had felt. I thought, despite everything, they loved him enough to mourn. I was so incredibly stupid. "Where is he?" Beatrice demanded, not looking at me on the floor but glaring at the paramedic. "Is it true? Is he dead?" "Yes, ma'am," the paramedic said softly. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Beatrice didn't cry, she didn't gasp. Her eyes widened, a terrifying, greedy spark igniting in her pupils. She turned to Richard. "Richard," she hissed, her voice vibrating with intense urgency. "Call the lawyers. Get them to freeze the business accounts before the board tries any funny business. We need to secure the assets immediately." Richard was already pulling out his phone, his face flushed with manic excitement. "Way ahead of you, B. I've got my guy on speed dial. We need to lock down the safety deposit boxes, too. God knows what the old man had hidden away in bearer bonds or gold." "Wait," Chloe said, stepping over me as if I were a discarded piece of furniture. She looked toward the grand staircase. "If he's dead, that means the master suite is open. I call dibs. I've always wanted that balcony view for my morning vlogs." "Don't be ridiculous, Chloe," Beatrice snapped, adjusting her designer scarf. "The master suite goes to the eldest. That's me. You can have the East Wing guest rooms." "Mom, you already have a house," Chloe whined, stomping her foot. "This is going to be my estate when we partition it. Uncle Richard wants the city properties. You want the liquid cash, I want the manor. We discussed this." "We discussed nothing officially, you little brat," Richard barked, holding his phone to his ear. "And the manor is worth $20 million on the land value alone. We're selling it to a developer. I need the capital for my new venture." I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, my vision blurring with fresh tears, completely unable to process what was happening. They were fighting over his bedroom. They were liquidating his life. The paramedics were literally still in the house, filling out the time-of-death paperwork, and my family was loudly auctioning off the remains of Arthur Sterling like scavengers tearing at a carcass. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice raw. None of them heard me. They were moving deeper into the house. "Stop it," I screamed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. They froze, turning to look at me. Beatrice's expression twisted into one of profound annoyance, as if a stray dog had wandered into her immaculate living room and soiled the rug. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Eleanor," Beatrice sighed, crossing her arms. "Stop being so hysterical, it's unseemly. Arthur was old. This was expected. We have to be practical now. The Sterling Empire doesn't pause for sentimentality. He's not even out of the house yet. I sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the drawing room. Have some damn respect, he was your father. Richard rolled his eyes, putting a hand over his phone's receiver. Save the dramatics for the funeral, Ellie. We have real adult business to handle here. In fact, you should probably start packing your things. Without Dad here to subsidize your little squatter arrangement, you're going to need to find a dorm room or a cheap apartment. The estate is going into probate, and we can't have non-owners living on the premises. My blood ran cold. You're kicking me out tonight. Well, maybe not tonight, Beatrice conceded generously. You can stay the week to pack. But Richard is right. Things are changing, Ellie. The gravy train is officially derailed. She turned away from me without another word, marching toward the drawing room. I watched, paralyzed, as she bypassed the covered body of my grandfather entirely, marching straight to the massive, custom-made silk drapes that hung over the bay windows. With a sharp, violent yank, she pulled the fabric, testing its strength. Yes, Beatrice muttered to herself, her eyes scanning the room. These definitely have to go, so depressing. That was the moment I broke. I ran. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't say goodbye. I ran out the front door, into the cold night air, back to my car, and drove away from the only home I had ever known. I returned to my tiny, cramped college apartment, locked the door, curled up on my cheap mattress, and sobbed until I passed out. I spent the next week in a haze. I didn't attend classes. I didn't eat. I only returned to the estate once, under the watchful, hostile eye of Chloe, to pack my meager belongings from my childhood room and box up my tools from the greenhouse. The house was already unrecognizable. The family had hired an appraiser who was walking through the halls, slapping yellow sticky notes on paintings, antique furniture, and rugs. They were cataloging their loot. Then came the day of the funeral. It was a massive, ostentatious affair, entirely orchestrated by Beatrice. She had turned my grandfather's memorial into a networking event. The church was packed with politicians, CEOs, and socialites. Beatrice wore a custom black mourning veil that looked like it belonged on a Paris runway. Richard handed out business cards at the wake. Chloe filmed a Get Ready With Me funeral edition for her followers. I sat in the very back pew, wearing a simple black dress, completely invisible. I didn't speak to them. They didn't speak to me. When the mahogany casket was finally lowered into the ground, it felt as though a massive, heavy iron door had slammed shut on my life. I was truly alone. 2 days later, the silence was broken. I was sitting in my apartment, staring blankly at a textbook I hadn't read a word of, when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of my grandfather's longtime legal firm, Harrison, Vance and Sterling. I picked it up. Hello. Eleanor. The crisp, professional voice of Mr. Vance came through the speaker. I am so incredibly sorry for your loss. Arthur was a great man and a dear friend. Thank you, Mr. Vance, I said numbly. I'm calling, Vance continued, his tone shifting into formal legal mode, to inform you that we have concluded the preliminary audit of Arthur's will. I am required to officially summon all named beneficiaries to my office tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for the formal reading and execution of the final testament. My heart gave a weak, tired flutter. Me, are you sure? I figured, I mean my aunt and uncle. You are explicitly named as a primary beneficiary, Eleanor, Vance said. I could hear a strange tightness in his voice, a hesitance that hadn't been there before. However, I must warn you. Arthur's instructions were highly specific and highly unusual. I strongly suggest you prepare yourself for a difficult morning. Difficult? I asked, my brow furrowing. What do you mean? I cannot disclose the contents of the will until all parties are present, Vance replied carefully. But your family has already been notified. They are extremely eager. Please, Eleanor. Just be here tomorrow at 10. The line clicked dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, a cold knot of dread slowly forming in my stomach. I remembered my grandfather's words in the greenhouse, the shadows flickering across his face. When the clock strikes midnight on my life, the true test begins. Midnight was here, and the vultures were already circling the lawyer's office, waiting to tear me apart. The elevator ride to the top floor of the Harrison, Vance and Sterling building felt less like an ascent into the heavens of corporate law and more like a slow, suffocating descent into a mausoleum. The polished steel doors reflected a ghost. I wore the same simple, high-necked black dress I had worn to the funeral, my face pale and completely devoid of makeup, my hair pulled back into a severe, messy knot. My eyes were ringed with deep, purple shadows of exhaustion. I hadn't slept a full hour since the phone call from Mr. Vance. When the elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal a sprawling reception area of imported Italian marble, frosted glass, and rich, dark mahogany, I hesitated. The air up here smelled of lemon oil, expensive espresso, and the sharp, intimidating tang of old, consolidated power. I gave my name to a receptionist whose tailored suit probably cost more than my car, and was immediately escorted down a long, hushed corridor lined with original oil paintings. At the very end of the hall stood a massive set of double oak doors, heavy and imposing. The receptionist didn't open them. She simply gestured toward them with a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile and retreated. I took a deep breath, the air shuddering in my lungs, and pushed the heavy brass handles down. The conference room was cavernous. A long, polished boardroom table dominated the space, surrounded by plush leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the city skyline, but no one in the room was looking at the view. They were already there. Aunt Beatrice, Uncle Richard, and Chloe were clustered at the far end of the table, looking less like a family in mourning and more like a corporate raiding party finalizing a hostile takeover. They had shed their black funeral attire. Beatrice was draped in a stark white, impeccably tailored cashmere pantsuit, her wrists heavy with gold bangles that clinked loudly against the mahogany table as she gestured. Richard wore a sharp, navy pinstripe suit, his tie loosened just enough to project an image of aggressive, casual wealth. Chloe, sitting with one leg crossed over the other, was tapping away on her phone, wearing a designer sundress that belonged on a yacht in Monaco, not a will reading. The atmosphere in the room was electric. It was a suffocating, almost physical aura of pure, unadulterated greed. They were practically vibrating. "I'm just saying, Richard," Beatrice was saying as I walked in, not bothering to lower her voice. "The Tuscany property is completely redundant. We've used it maybe twice in the last decade. It's a massive tax sink. The moment the title transfers, I'm listing it. I have a buyer in Dubai who is extremely interested in the vineyard acreage." "You can't just unilaterally sell the overseas holdings, B," Richard countered, leaning forward and tapping a gold Montblanc pen against his notepad. "If the estate is put into a holding company, we can leverage the Tuscany property as collateral to float a low-interest loan. I have a commercial real estate venture in Midtown that needs a cash injection by Q3. We use the dead assets to fund the active ones. It's basic synergy." Excuse me," Chloe chimed in, not looking up from her phone. "Grandpa promised me the vintage Porsche collection. If you guys try to liquidate the garage to fund some boring office building, I am literally going to sue both of you. My followers are already expecting a garage tour vlog next month." I closed the doors behind me. The heavy thud echoed in the large room, finally drawing their attention. The manic energy instantly evaporated, replaced by a collective, palpable wave of annoyance. Beatrice's lips thinned into a hard, unimpressed line. Richard sighed heavily, tossing his expensive pen onto the table as if my mere presence was an exhausting inconvenience. Chloe simply rolled her eyes and went back to scrolling. "Well," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with icy condescension. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. I was beginning to think you were going to make us wait all morning, Eleanor." "I'm 5 minutes early, Aunt Beatrice," I said quietly, pulling out a heavy leather chair at the absolute opposite end of the table. I felt a desperate need to put as much physical distance between us as the room would allow. "Don't talk back to your Aunt Ellie," Richard barked, checking his gold Rolex. "We have a lot of complex financial restructuring to get through today, and we don't have time for your usual sullen attitude. Just sit there, keep your mouth shut, and let the adults handle the transition." I sank into the chair, wrapping my arms around my stomach. I felt physically ill. They spoke about my grandfather's life's work, his home, his cars, the vineyards he had lovingly cultivated in Italy, as if they were nothing but numbers on a ledger to be deleted and traded. Before I could formulate a response, the side door of the conference room opened. Mr. Vance walked in. He was a tall, incredibly thin man in his late 60s, with snow-white hair and a face deeply lined with decades of legal battles and corporate stress. But today, he looked entirely hollowed out. He carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio under one arm, and his eyes, usually sharp and discerning, looked incredibly tired. He had been Arthur's personal lawyer and one of his few genuine friends for 40 years. He took his seat at the head of the table, exactly halfway between my family and me. He placed the portfolio down, adjusted his silver-rimmed reading glasses, and looked around the room. When his eyes met mine, I saw a profound, heavy sadness in them. It made my heart hammer painfully against my ribs. "Good morning," Mr. Vance said, his voice a dry, gravelly monotone. "We are gathered here today for the formal reading and execution of the last will and testament of Arthur Reginald Sterling. I must inform you all that this document, drafted and finalized only 6 months ago, supersedes any and all previous wills, trusts, or verbal agreements. It is ironclad, legally binding, and not subject to negotiation." "Yes, yes, we know the boilerplate, Vance," Richard interrupted impatiently, waving a hand. "Let's get to the brass tacks. We have accountants standing by to initiate the transfers." Vance stopped. He looked at Richard with a cold, terrifying stillness that instantly silenced the room. For a fleeting second, he looked exactly like my grandfather. "Mr. Sterling," Vance said softly, "Arthur was a friend of mine. You will afford this process the solemnity it requires, or I will clear this room and read it to the court stenographer alone. Am I understood?" Richard swallowed hard, his arrogant posture shrinking slightly. "Understood, apologies." Vance nodded slowly. He unclasped the portfolio and drew out a thick stack of heavy, watermarked parchment. "I, Arthur Reginald Sterling," Vance began reading, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I have lived a long life. I have built an empire from steel, sweat, and time. But an empire is only as strong as the stewards who inherit it. I have observed my family closely. I have seen their priorities, their ambitions, and their true natures." Vance paused, turning the page. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Chloe had put her phone down. "To my eldest daughter, Beatrice Sterling," Vance read, and Beatrice immediately sat up straighter, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "I leave the entirety of my liquid capital, currently held in domestic accounts, the overseas properties, including the Tuscany estate, and a 40% controlling stake in the primary Sterling Holdings Trust. May you find the societal validation you so desperately seek." Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure delight. She didn't even seem to register the stinging insult at the end of the sentence. She just slapped the table in victory, mouthing the words 40% to herself. "To my son, Richard Sterling," Vance continued. Richard leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. "I leave the entirety of my commercial real estate portfolio, the remaining 60% controlling stake in Sterling Holdings, and the total sum of my diverse blue-chip stock portfolio. May you learn that true wealth is built, not gambled." "Yes," Richard hissed, pumping a fist under the table. "I knew it. I knew the old man would come through. The holding company is mine. To my granddaughter, Chloe Sterling," Vance read, and Chloe squealed softly. "I leave the primary family estate, the manor house, all surrounding acreage, and the complete contents of the automotive garages. May you understand the difference between value and a price tag." "Oh my God," Chloe breathed, fanning her face with her hand. "The manor, it's mine. Mom, I'm throwing a massive party this weekend. We have to hire a DJ." I sat at the end of the table, entirely paralyzed. It was a total, utter capitulation. My grandfather, the man who saw right through their greed, the man who called them defective gears and vultures, had given them everything. He had handed the keys to the kingdom to the very people who had spent their lives waiting for him to die. The estate, the money, the companies, the cars. It was millions upon millions of dollars. It was total victory for the absolute worst people I knew. My vision swam. It wasn't about the money for me. I had never wanted a mansion or a sports car. I just wanted to finish my degree and maybe, someday, open a small clock repair shop. But the betrayal cut deep. To give them the house, our house, The place where we spent countless hours in the greenhouse was a staggering blow. Chloe was going to turn his beloved workshop into a party lounge. Beatrice was going to sell his sanctuary in Italy. The family was erupting in a chaotic, jubilant celebration. Beatrice and Richard were already rapidly debating how to structure a board meeting to consolidate their newfound shares. Chloe was taking a selfie with the conference room window as a backdrop. They had won. Mr. Vance cleared his throat. The sound was harsh, commanding, "I am not finished." The family quieted down, though their faces were still flushed with manic joy. They looked at Vance expectantly, like children waiting for the final piece of candy. Vance slowly lowered the document. He looked across the long expanse of the mahogany table, past the gloating faces of my aunt, uncle, and cousin. He looked directly at me. The deep, sorrowful pity in his eyes was back, heavier than ever. He took a slow, deep breath, as if bracing himself for an impact. "Finally," Vance said, his voice dropping to a somber register. "To my youngest granddaughter, Eleanor Sterling, my favorite." The room instantly bristled. Beatrice's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. Richard crossed his arms defensively. Even Chloe glared at me. The word favorite hung in the air like a slap in the face to the rest of them. My heart leapt into my throat. I didn't care what it was. A book from his library, a set of his old drafting tools. Just some acknowledgement that what we had was real. Vance looked back down at the paper. He read the next sentence slowly, deliberately, as if every word tasted like ash. "To my favorite granddaughter, Eleanor, I leave my antique brass pocket watch, so she always knows the value of time." A suffocating, ringing silence slammed down over the conference room. I stared at Mr. Vance, my mind totally blank. A watch? He had hundreds of watches. He had priceless Patek Philippe's, rare Bregutts, chronometers that belonged to 18th century naval captains. Vance reached into his leather portfolio. He didn't pull out a polished mahogany display box. He didn't pull out a velvet-lined case. He pulled out a small, faded, drawstring canvas pouch. He placed it on the polished table and with a heavy sigh pushed it. The pouch slid across the long expanse of mahogany, coming to a stop directly in front of me. I looked down at it. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely untie the frayed string. I opened the pouch and tipped the contents into my palm. A heavy lump of metal dropped into my hand. It was a pocket watch, yes, but it was hideous. It was made of cheap, base brass that had tarnished into a sickly, mottled green and black. The metal was pitted and deeply scratched, as if it had been dragged behind a car on a gravel road. The glass crystal over the face was fractured, a spiderweb of deep cracks obscuring the dial underneath. The winding crown at the top was bent at a weird angle, completely rusted solid. It didn't tick. It was dead, cold, and heavy. It wasn't just cheap, it was garbage. It was a piece of junk you would find at a flea market for $5 and leave behind because it wasn't worth the effort to clean. I stared at the rusted hunk of metal in my shaking palm. So she always knows the value of time. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. A burning, acidic lump formed in my throat. I looked up, desperate, confused, seeking some kind of explanation from Mr. Vance. But the lawyer had closed his eyes, rubbing his temples, refusing to meet my gaze. And then, the silence broke. It started as a low snort from Chloe. Then, Uncle Richard let out a bark of laughter. Within seconds, the entire end of the table had erupted into howling, cruel, unrestrained mockery. "Oh my God!" Chloe shrieked, clutching her stomach, tears of mirth literally rolling down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "A broken watch? He left the little mechanic a piece of literal garbage." "I can't breathe." "The value of time?" Richard wheezed, slamming his hand on the table. "Oh, Arthur, you absolute brilliant bastard. The favorite granddaughter gets a rusted piece of junk while the adults get the empire. That is poetic. That is absolute poetry." Beatrice was laughing so hard she had to lean against Richard for support. "Oh, Eleanor," she gasped, wiping her eyes with a manicured finger. "I suppose all those hours you spent breathing in fumes in that filthy greenhouse really paid off, didn't they? You played the dutiful little orphan, and he gave you a paperweight. Tell me, dear, is it a Rolex? No. Just scrap metal." I sat there, frozen. the cruel, piercing sound of their laughter echoing off the glass walls of the conference room, drilling into my skull. The heat radiating from my face was intense. Tears of absolute, crushing humiliation spilled over my eyelashes, dropping silently onto the cracked glass of the worthless watch in my hand. It wasn't the lack of money. I swear to God, it wasn't the money. It was the insult. It was the public, humiliating degradation. He had given the family he despised millions, and he had given the granddaughter who worshipped him a rusted piece of trash, framing it with a sarcastic, mocking quote about time. Why? Was he angry with me at the end? Was his mind failing him in those final months? Was it some cruel, twisted joke? The man I loved, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had used his final act on earth to turn me into the punchline of a joke for the people who hated me the most. All right, settle down, Richard chuckled, wiping his face and composing himself, though a vicious, triumphant smirk remained plastered on his face. He looked at me, his eyes cold and entirely devoid of empathy. The reading is over, the assets are distributed. Now, Alina, about your current living situation. I didn't look up, I kept my eyes locked on the tarnished brass in my hand. I already packed my things, I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm not staying at the estate. Good, Chloe snapped, suddenly serious, her voice taking on the sharp, authoritative edge of a new property owner. Because I'm having the locks changed at noon today. Security is being briefed. If you try to come onto the property, you'll be arrested for trespassing. And don't even think about trying to break into the greenhouse to steal his tools. Everything on that property belongs to me now. We'll have our lawyers draw up a formal eviction notice just to be safe, Vance, Beatrice added smoothly, standing up and smoothing her immaculate white pantsuit. Now, if we are entirely finished with this depressing sideshow, Richard and I have a board meeting to schedule. We are adjourned, Mr. Vance said quietly. He stood up, packing his papers away quickly. He still wouldn't look at me. The family didn't even say goodbye. They swept out of the conference room in a flurry of expensive fabric and loud, gloating conversation, completely ignoring my existence. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. I was alone in the massive room. Just me and the rusted watch. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't cry anymore. The shock had burned away the tears, leaving only a cold, hollow, aching void in my chest. I slipped the heavy, useless watch into the pocket of my black dress. I walked out of the conference room, past the receptionist who wouldn't meet my eyes, down the elevator, and out into the glaring, unforgiving sunlight of the city. I drove my beat-up Civic back to my apartment. I locked the deadbolt. I pulled the cheap, plastic blinds shut, plunging the small, cramped room into a dim, depressing gloom. I took the watch out of my pocket and placed it gently on my small, battered desk, right next to my textbooks and my small, portable set of watchmaking tools. For 2 days, I did absolutely nothing. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of traffic outside. The depression was a physical weight, pinning me to the mattress. My family was out there, popping champagne, dividing up his legacy, tearing down his home. And I was here, discarded and abandoned, left with a rusted insult. On the evening of the 3rd day, the hunger finally forced me out of bed. I ate a stale piece of toast and drank a glass of tap water. As I stood in the tiny kitchenette, my eyes drifted back to the desk, back to the watch. It sat there, an ugly, tarnished lump. I walked over to the desk and picked it up. It felt strangely heavy for a standard pocket watch, unusually dense. I ran my thumb over the pitted brass casing. The metal was cold. A sudden, irrational surge of anger flared in my chest. Why this specific piece of junk? Arthur Sterling was a master horologist. He could build a tourbillon from scratch. He abhorred poor craftsmanship. He wouldn't keep a piece of rusted garbage in his collection, let alone leave it in his will as his final statement to me. Unless, the thought was tiny, a fleeting spark in the suffocating darkness of my grief. I sat down at the desk. I flipped on the harsh, bright beam of my articulated desk lamp. I reached into my toolkit and pulled out my jeweler's loupe, strapping the magnifying lens over my right eye. I picked up the watch and held it directly under the intense light, bringing it millimeters from my eye. With the magnification, the rust didn't look like natural oxidation. It looked applied. It looked like an acid-etched patina, deliberately painted onto the brass to simulate age and decay. My heart gave a strange, stuttering thump. I turned the watch over, examining the back casing. Usually, a pocket watch has a subtle hinge or a tiny lip where a case knife can be inserted to pop the back off and expose the movement. This watch had neither. The back casing was completely seamless. It was a solid block of metal. I moved my attention to the bent, rusted winding crown at the top. It looked totally seized, fused to the stem by years of neglect. But under the loop, I saw something that made the breath catch in my throat. At the base of the winding stem, hidden beneath the artificial rust, was a microscopic, laser-cut groove. It wasn't a standard horological fitting. It was a locking pin. This wasn't a watch. My hands began to shake, but this time, it wasn't from grief. It was the adrenaline of a puzzle. It was the familiar, electric thrill of sitting in the greenhouse with Arthur, dissecting a mechanical mystery. I reached for my precision tweezers. With extreme care, I scraped away a tiny flake of the fake rust near the crown. Underneath, the brass was pristine, machined with aerospace-level precision. If I put this wheel back into the clock, what will happen? It will jam. The friction will be wrong. His words echoed in my mind, crystal clear. He didn't build a broken watch. He built a mechanism that appeared broken to anyone who didn't know how to look. To the vultures, it was garbage. To a mechanic, it was a lock. I set the tweezers down. I closed my eyes, visualizing the internal geometry of a solid brass cylinder. If there's no hinge, and the crown is a locking pin, the release mechanism has to be kinetic. I opened my eyes. I gripped the heavy brass casing in my left hand. With my right thumb and forefinger, I pinched the bent winding crown. Instead of trying to turn it, which would be the instinct of a normal person trying to wind a watch, I pulled it straight up. It didn't budge. I reassessed. A puzzle box, a sequence. I looked at the fractured glass crystal over the face. The cracks were severe, totally obscuring the numbers. But under the loop, I realized the cracks weren't random impacts. They formed a geometric pattern, a starburst radiating from the center pinion. I pressed my thumbs flat against the shattered glass. I applied a firm, even pressure and twisted counterclockwise. With a soft, metallic scrape, the entire bezel, the metal ring holding the glass, rotated exactly a quarter inch. Click. A tiny, almost imperceptible sound echoed from deep inside the brass casing. My heart was hammering so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The crown. I reached back up to the bent winding crown. I didn't pull it. I pushed it down, depressing it into the casing like a button. Click. Another internal mechanism shifted. Now, the sequence. I twisted the bezel back clockwise. I depressed the crown twice. I rotated the heavy brass loop attached to the top of the watch 90 degrees to the right. The heavy, dense block of metal in my hand suddenly felt entirely different. The internal tension had vanished. I held my breath. I placed my thumbs on the seamless back casing and applied a lateral sliding pressure. For a second, nothing happened. And then, with a smooth, perfectly silent hydraulic glide, the entire backplate of the watch slid horizontally off its tracks. The watch didn't contain gears. It didn't contain a mainspring, an escapement, or a balance wheel. The inside of the brass casing was hollowed out, lined with a shock-absorbent black velvet. Resting in the very center of the cavity, gleaming under the harsh light of my desk lamp, was a tiny, black microSD card. Next to it, folded into a meticulous, tiny square, was a piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to use the tweezers to extract the paper. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the sharp, elegant, architectural script of Arthur Reginald Sterling. The ink was black, the message short. My dearest Ellie. Time is money, kiddo. Let them have the bait. I stared at the note, the words blurring as a fresh, entirely different wave of tears flooded my eyes. I looked down at the tiny, black plastic square resting in the velvet cavity of the masterfully engineered puzzle box. The true test had begun, and the vultures had already failed. My hands were still trembling as I slid the microSD card into the tiny USB adapter. My laptop, a bulky 5-year-old brick covered in engineering decals that sounded like a jet engine when it ran too many tabs, sat on my cheap laminate desk. I plugged the adapter into the port. A small, white File Explorer window popped onto the screen. There was no complex encryption software, no password prompt. There was only a single, heavily compressed MP4 video file, simply titled, "For a leaner MP4," and a PDF document titled the Mainspring PDF. I clicked the video. The screen went black for a second, the fan of my laptop whirring in the agonizing silence of my apartment. Then, the image flickered to life. It was the greenhouse. The lighting was dim, illuminated only by the warm, amber glow of the brass task lamps over the main workbench. Sitting in the center of the frame, looking directly into the camera, was Arthur Sterling. He looked healthy. This must have been recorded a year ago, before the fatigue of his final months set in. He was wearing his heavy canvas work apron, his magnifying loupe pushed up onto his forehead, a half-finished antique pocket watch resting on the velvet mat in front of him. Seeing him alive, moving, breathing, it was a physical blow to my chest. I choked back a sob, pressing my hands hard against my mouth so I wouldn't miss a single word. "Hello, Ellie." His deep, gravelly voice echoed from the tinny speakers of my laptop. A slow, warm smile spread across his weathered face, a smile he reserved entirely, exclusively for me. "If you are watching this, it means the mainspring has finally wound down. It means I am gone. And it means you solved the puzzle. I never doubted you would. I purposefully seized that winding crown with a microscopic dab of industrial epoxy, knowing only my favorite apprentice would recognize the artificial patina and understand the kinetic sequence to release the casing. You always did have a better eye for detail than I did." He chuckled softly, leaning back in his stool, the leather creaking. The sound was so familiar it broke my heart all over again. "I imagine," Arthur continued, his smile fading into an expression of grim, resolute seriousness, "that the last few days have been incredibly difficult for you. I imagine Vance read the will. I imagine my children and your cousin behaved exactly as I expected them to. I imagine they took the bait, they took the empire, and they likely made a spectacle of your inheritance. For that public humiliation, my dear Ellie, I am profoundly sorry. It was a cruel thing to put you through, but it was absolutely necessary." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the workbench, his piercing blue eyes staring right through the camera lens, right into my soul. "I told you once that my children were defective gears. I told you that time is the ultimate truth-teller. For the last 40 years, I have artificially shielded Beatrice, Richard, and Chloe from the consequences of their own staggering incompetence. I paid their debts, I funded their lifestyles, and I allowed them to believe they were titans. But an empire built on an illusion cannot stand." Arthur reached out and picked up a small, complex brass gear assembly from the desk, rotating it in his calloused fingers. "The estate Vance handed them today," he explained, his voice taking on the sharp, clinical tone of a master engineer explaining a mechanism, "is a trap. A perfectly constructed, self-destructing mechanism. Yes, the asset valuations are astronomically high on paper, but what Richard's hubris and Beatrice's greed blinded them to is the overhead, the carrying costs, the liability." He pointed a finger at the camera. "I legally restructured the entirety of Sterling Holdings 3 years ago. The commercial real estate Richard just inherited is deeply tied to ballooning interest rates on maintenance clauses. The Tuscany property Beatrice wants to sell so badly. I placed a historic, irrevocable conservation easement on the land. It cannot be legally developed, subdivided, or sold to a commercial buyer. It is virtually unsellable and costs hundreds of thousands a year in taxes. And the manor." Arthur smiled faintly. "The manor is a 200-year-old stone beast with a failing foundation, a plumbing system that needs a total gut, and property taxes that will drain Chloe's liquid accounts within 18 months if she tries to maintain her current lifestyle. I left them a massive, beautiful sinking ship, and I left them at the helm without a single lifeboat." He set the gear down. "I knew that if I cut them out of the will completely, they would tie the estate up in probate court for a decade. They would drag you into a brutal, endless legal war, contesting my sanity, trying to bleed you dry. By giving them exactly what they wanted, they accepted the will without a second thought. They locked themselves into the trap. Legally, they can never contest it now." Arthur reached into his apron pocket, He pulled out a sleek, black metal card and placed it on the desk. Which brings us to you, Ellie. The PDF file accompanying this video contains the cryptographic keys, routing numbers, and legal authentication protocols for an offshore, blind trust entity established in Geneva, entirely outside the jurisdiction of the United States probate courts. It was funded quietly, over decades, through private dividends they never knew existed. My breath hitched, I stared at the screen, paralyzed. The trust, Arthur said softly, contains exactly 20 million US dollars. It is completely clean, legally untouchable, and solely in your name. It is the true legacy of my life's work. It is yours, Ellie, to build your own life, to open your shop, to be safe. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and fast, dripping off my jaw onto my collarbone. The sterling empire they inherited will collapse, Arthur concluded, his voice softening into a gentle, fatherly tone. It is mathematically inevitable. Do not help them. Do not warn them. Let gravity do the work. You are free now, Ellie. You are my greatest joy and my proudest achievement. I love you. Goodbye. The video ended. The screen went black. I sat in the darkness of my apartment for a long, long time. The crushing, suffocating weight of the betrayal that had been crushing my chest for the last 3 days vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, tidal wave of awe. He hadn't abandoned me. He had orchestrated a masterpiece. He had sacrificed his own posthumous reputation with the vultures to ensure I was absolutely, flawlessly protected. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my shirt, my hand steadying. I closed the video player and opened the PDF. It was 30 pages of dense, complex international financial law, complete with contact information for a highly exclusive fiduciary firm in Zurich. The grief was still there, a hollow ache in my bones, but the despair was gone. In its place was a cold, bright, hyper-focused clarity. I had work to do. The next morning, I didn't go to Vance. Vance was a good man, but he was legally bound to the primary estate, which meant he was legally bound to my family. I needed a shark of my own. I spent hours researching, utilizing the secure VPN protocols my grandfather had detailed in the document, until I found her. Her name was Evelyn Cross. She was a senior partner at a boutique, aggressively discreet wealth management firm that catered exclusively to lottery winners, tech billionaires, and stealth wealth inheritors. Her office wasn't in a towering glass skyscraper. It was in an unmarked, heavily secured brownstone in a quiet historic district. When I walked into her office, wearing my best, and only, thrifted blazer, she looked at me with calculating, razor-sharp eyes. But when I slid my laptop across her desk and showed her the PDF, her demeanor instantly shifted from polite skepticism to profound, professional respect. "Your grandfather," Evelyn murmured, adjusting her designer glasses as she scanned the routing architecture of the Geneva Trust, "was a terrifyingly brilliant man, Miss Sterling. This trust structure it's a fortress. It bypasses domestic probate entirely through a series of corporate shell transfers that are completely legal but virtually invisible." "Can they find it?" I asked, my voice tight. "My family. If they audit the main estate." Evelyn laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "Find it? Miss Sterling, your family couldn't find this money if they had the entire forensic accounting department of the FBI working for them. It never touched the main estate's ledgers. To them, and to the IRS, this money simply does not exist. It is already yours." Within 48 hours, the secure, encrypted accounts Evelyn set up for me were fully operational. I sat in her office, holding an iPad, staring at a banking interface that displayed a number so incomprehensibly large, it felt like a glitch in a video game. $20,014,500 and 0 cents. I didn't buy a supercar. I didn't buy a mansion. That was the behavior of defective gears. My first act as a multimillionaire was to log into my university portal and pay off my $42,000 in student loans in a single, unceremonious click. The relief that washed over me was a physical high, a release of tension I didn't even know I was carrying. My second act was to hire Evelyn's firm on a permanent retainer to manage the bulk of the trust in low-risk, high-yield index funds. My third act was to disappear from the Sterling family's radar completely. I didn't block their phone numbers or their social media accounts. Blocking them would imply I cared enough to be bothered. Instead, I simply muted them. I became a ghost. I moved out of my cramped, depressing college apartment, but I didn't move to a penthouse. I found a beautiful, spacious loft in a quiet, industrial part of the city. It had exposed brick walls, massive windows that let in rivers of natural light, and top-tier security. I bought a comfortable mattress. I bought fresh groceries without checking my bank balance. And, most importantly, I transformed the massive spare bedroom of the loft into a state-of-the-art horology laboratory. I bought vintage, restored Schablin lathes. I bought ultrasonic cavitation cleaners, custom-milled brass, and the finest optical loops money could buy. I spent my evenings sitting at my beautiful, heavy oak workbench, listening to Vivaldi, breathing in the scent of machine oil, restoring antique clocks while my net worth quietly generated more money in interest every week than I had ever made in a year. I finished my mechanical engineering degree in absolute peace, and from the quiet safety of my sanctuary, I watched the social media circus begin. It started exactly as Arthur had predicted. The euphoria of the inheritance fueled a staggering display of toxic, loud consumption. Chloe was the loudest. Her Instagram feed transformed into a relentless assault of old money aesthetic content. She posted daily vlogs titled Transforming My Historic Manor. I watched, sipping high-end loose-leaf tea in my loft, as she hired a team of trendy interior decorators who proceeded to destroy the house. They took the priceless, hand-carved mahogany wall paneling in the library, wood that Arthur had shipped from Brazil in the 1980s, and painted it a horrific, sterile, matte white. They ripped out the antique Persian rugs to install cheap, gray laminate flooring, because it looked cleaner on camera. She posted a video standing in front of my grandfather's pristine, vintage 1960s Porsche 911. Just inherited this cute little vintage car, she squealed to her millions of followers. We're going to wrap it matte pink and put an iPad in the dashboard. It hurt to watch, a dull ache in my chest, but I remembered Arthur's words. Let them have the bait. Aunt Beatrice was no better. She embarked on a vanity project of epic proportions. She launched Aura by Beatrice, an absurdly overpriced lifestyle brand. She rented a massive retail space in the most expensive district in the city, outfitting it with imported marble, and hiring a staff of models to stand around looking bored. She sold $500 candles and quantum healing crystals. She posted photos of herself jet-setting to Paris and Milan on sourcing trips, flying first class, staying in five-star suites, burning through liquid capital like dry kindling. Uncle Richard, true to form, styled himself as the ultimate finance guru. He did podcasts. He rented a billboard on the highway with his face on it, advertising his new holding company. His LinkedIn was a nightmare of corporate jargon. I watched through a burner account as he announced he was leveraging the commercial real estate he inherited to make a massive, disruptive play in the decentralized finance sector. In short, he took out massive loans against the real estate to buy millions of dollars of a highly volatile, obscure cryptocurrency just before the market peaked. For the first 6 months, they looked like gods. They were the toast of their shallow, vapid social circles. They threw massive parties at the manor, leaving empty champagne bottles scattered across the lawns. I received exactly one piece of correspondence from them during this time. A Christmas card, signed by Beatrice. It was a photo of the three of them standing in front of the manor, dripping in designer clothes. Inside, Beatrice had written, "Hope your little apartment is staying warm, Ellie. We're thinking of you." It wasn't a greeting, it was a gloat. It was a malicious reminder of my place. I didn't reply. I dropped the card into my kitchen trash can, walked back to my workbench, and delicately placed a ruby jewel bearing into the escapement of an 18th century carriage clock I was restoring for a private client. The turning point happened around month 10. The first cracks in their gilded facade were subtle. Chloe stopped posting daily vlogs from the manor. Her content shifted heavily to sponsored posts for questionable detox teas and fast fashion brands. Then, I noticed the backgrounds of her photos. The manor looked cold. In one video, where she was unboxing makeup, she was wearing a heavy winter parka inside the house. Arthur had warned them. The heating bill for that massive, drafty stone beast in the dead of winter was roughly $15,000 a month. And with her liquid cash tied up in designer bags and pink car wraps, Chloe was freezing. By month 12, the cracks became structural fractures. The cryptocurrency market experienced a historic, catastrophic crash. Trillions of dollars of imaginary wealth evaporated overnight. Uncle Richard's disruptive play went to zero. Literally zero. I read a brief, dry article in the local Financial Times detailing the collapse of his holding firm. The banks immediately called in the loans he had taken out to buy the crypto. Because he had used the commercial real estate as collateral, the banks seized the properties. All of them. In a matter of weeks, Uncle Richard went from a paper millionaire to possessing a negative net worth in the 8 figures. He vanished from the internet. His podcast was deleted. His billboard was replaced by an ad for a personal injury lawyer. Beatrice's downfall was slower, but equally spectacular. Aura by Beatrice was a colossal failure. Nobody wanted a $500 candle. The rent on her luxury retail space was astronomical, and the payroll was bleeding her dry. She tried to execute her backup plan, selling the Tuscany property to the buyers in Dubai. I actually pulled up the public property records to watch this unfold. I saw the listing go live for $12 million. 2 weeks later, a public addendum was attached to the listing by the Italian authorities, enforcing the historic conservation easement my grandfather had secretly implemented. The listing price plummeted to $2 million. Then to $1 million. Then it was pulled off the market entirely. It was unsellable, and the Italian property taxes were brutal. By month 18, the silence from their end of the world was deafening. The social media posts had completely stopped. Beatrice's boutique had a brown paper, closed for renovations, sign taped over the windows, a polite fiction for bankruptcy. The bank had fully repossessed Richard's portfolio. The trap had sprung perfectly. The heavy iron jaws of consequence had slammed shut, crushing their illusions of grandeur. And through it all, I practiced the most exquisite form of malicious compliance imaginable. I did exactly what they demanded at the will reading. I stayed out of their lives. I didn't gloat. I didn't send them anonymous messages. I didn't offer help. I let them suffocate in the vacuum of their own making. I was thriving. I had launched a highly successful, strictly referral-based antique horology restoration business. I was known in elite collector circles as a ghost, a master mechanic who operated out of an undisclosed location. I charged exorbitant fees, not because I needed the money, but because my grandfather had taught me to never undervalue my time. My investments had grown the trust to over $22 million. I was healthy, I was rested, and I was happy. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in November, almost exactly 2 years since my grandfather's death. The weather was a bitter, freezing sleet that rattled against the massive industrial windows of my loft. Inside, it was warm. A fire was crackling in the modern fireplace, and I was sitting at my workbench, a magnifying loupe over my eye, performing a final timing adjustment on a beautiful, complex Patek Philippe pocket watch. Right next to my tools, resting on a small, velvet display stand, was Arthur's tarnished, rusted puzzle box. I kept it exactly as it was, a constant reminder of the brilliance of the man who saved me. The silence of the loft was broken by a sudden, jarring sound. My personal cell phone was vibrating on the desk, the harsh buzzing echoing over the soft classical music playing from the speakers. I paused, my tweezers hovering over a delicate hairspring. I rarely got calls on this number. Evelyn had her own dedicated line, and my clients used an encrypted portal. I lowered the tweezers. I reached out and picked up the phone. The screen was glaringly bright in the dim light of my workstation. I stared at the caller ID, the blood in my veins turning to absolute ice. It was a number I hadn't seen in 2 years. A number I had muted but never deleted specifically so I would know if this moment ever arrived. Aunt Beatrice. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. It went to voicemail. I set the phone back down. I picked up my tweezers, my hand perfectly steady, and returned my focus to the microscopic gears of the watch. 10 seconds later, the phone buzzed again. An automated transcription notification popped up on the screen. It was a voicemail. I slowly pulled the loop off my head. I reached for the phone, tapped the notification, and pressed play, bringing the speaker to my ear. The voice that came through the speaker was unrecognizable. It wasn't the sharp, haughty, aristocratic drawl of the woman who had mocked my clothes and measured my grandfather's drapes while he was eating dinner. It was a voice ragged with exhaustion, choked with panic, and trembling with a profound, terrifying desperation. Eleanor, Ellie, please pick up. I know you're probably at work, or studying, I don't know. Please, you have to call me back, it's an emergency. The bank is foreclosing on the manor tomorrow. Chloe is having a breakdown. Richard won't return my calls. We have nowhere to go, Ellie. We have absolutely nothing left. Please, your family. We need you. Call me back. The message clicked, followed by a dial tone. I sat in the warm, quiet sanctuary of my loft, the sound of the freezing rain lashing against the glass. I looked at the rusted puzzle box on the desk. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a rush of euphoric vengeance. I felt something much colder, much more absolute. The trap had done its job. The mechanism had ground itself to dust. They thought I was still the poor, helpless orphan. They thought they could reach down into the dirt and drag me into their collapse, using family as a weapon to guilt me into draining whatever meager savings I had built to save them from the streets. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Beatrice back. I opened my contacts, scrolled down to the E section, and tapped the number for Evelyn Cross. She answered on the first ring, her tone crisp and alert despite the late hour. "Good evening, Eleanor, is everything all right?" "Hello, Evelyn," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Everything is perfect. I need you to run a title search on the Sterling estate properties. Specifically, the primary manor. Find out which bank holds the default notes, and find out what time the foreclosure auction is scheduled for tomorrow." I could hear the click of Evelyn's keyboard in the background. "Consider it done. Are we acquiring assets, Eleanor?" I looked at the rusted watch. I thought of the white paint smeared over the mahogany library, the destroyed greenhouse, the insults, the laughter in the conference room. "Yes," I said quietly. "We're going shopping." The rain from the night before hadn't stopped. It had merely shifted from a violent, freezing sleet to a relentless, dismal gray downpour that turned the city streets into slick ribbons of black glass. I sat in a booth at the back of a mid-tier, aggressively beige chain coffee shop on the edge of the financial district. I had chosen the location very specifically. It was halfway between my loft and the legal offices, where Beatrice was spending her final hours trying to stave off the inevitable. More importantly, it was the kind of pedestrian, unglamorous place my aunt would have previously crossed the street to avoid. I was 10 minutes early. I wore a simple, beautifully tailored black cashmere turtleneck, dark denim, and an understated pair of leather boots. There were no visible logos on my clothing, no flashy jewelry, save for a vintage, perfectly restored Vacheron Constantin watch with a subtle black leather strap that cost more than my first car. My hair was loose, clean, and styled. I looked healthy. I looked rested. I looked like a woman who had spent the last 2 years completely insulated from the toxic radiation of the Sterling family. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that violently contrasted with the two women who shuffled through the entrance. I almost didn't recognize them. Aunt Beatrice, once a towering monument of arrogant high society, looked entirely deflated. She was wearing a trench coat that had clearly once been expensive, but was now wrinkled and improperly buttoned, revealing a stained silk blouse underneath. Her hair, usually a helmet of impeccable salon styling, was frizzy and damp from the rain. She looked 10 years older. The skin around her eyes was pulled tight, bruised with purple shadows of exhaustion, and her hands were trembling as she lowered her dripping umbrella. Behind her was Chloe. The golden child of Instagram had entirely lost her luster. She was wearing oversized sweatpants and a bulky, faded hoodie pulled up over her head. She had no makeup on, and her skin looked pale and sallow. The manic, condescending energy that used to radiate from her like a heat lamp was completely extinguished, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a cornered animal. They scanned the coffee shop, their eyes darting past the college students on laptops and the businessmen getting their morning caffeine fix. When Beatrice's eyes finally landed on me, a flicker of relief washed over her haggard face, immediately followed by the old, ingrained instinct to command and demand. They walked over to the booth and slid into the vinyl seat across from me. They smelled faintly of damp wool, stale perfume, and the sharp, sour metallic tang of sheer panic. "Eleanor," Beatrice breathed, placing her trembling hands flat on the faux wood table. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't ask how I was. The pleasantries of polite society had evaporated. "Thank God you actually answered your phone. I thought we were going to have to track down your apartment building." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. "Hello, Aunt Beatrice, Chloe." Chloe didn't look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the table, her fingernails, no longer perfectly manicured, but chipped and bitten down to the quick, picking anxiously at a seam in the vinyl booth. "We don't have much time," Beatrice rushed on, her voice a hushed, frantic whisper, leaning across the table as if trying to physically pull me into her crisis. "The situation has become untenable. The bank is being completely unreasonable. They are executing a foreclosure on the manor at noon today. We've managed to stall the liquidation of the Tuscany property, but the legal fees are astronomical, and Richard has completely disappeared. The coward took what little liquid cash he had left and fled to a non-extradition country, leaving me holding the bag on the corporate liabilities." She paused, taking a ragged, shuddering breath. "We have been locked out of the estate accounts. The credit lines are frozen. We need cash, Ellie, immediately, just to secure a legal injunction against the foreclosure and to put down a deposit on a rental property. We literally have nowhere to sleep tonight." I set my coffee cup down softly. "And you came to me. Your family?" Beatrice hissed, her eyes widening with a desperate, pleading intensity that made my skin crawl. "You are Arthur's granddaughter. We are all that's left of the Sterling legacy. We have to stick together in times of crisis." "Family," I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "That's an interesting word, Beatrice. I don't recall being family when you kicked me out of the house the day Grandpa died. I don't recall being family when you laughed at me in Mr. Vance's office. In fact, if memory serves, I was just the pathetic orphan cousin who got a rusted paperweight." Beatrice flinched, a flash of genuine shame crossing her face, though it was quickly swallowed by her survival instinct. That was grief, Eleanor. We were all grieving. People say things they don't mean when they are mourning. You know how much your grandfather loved this family. You know he wouldn't want to see us on the streets. He wouldn't want to see his beloved manor auctioned off to some faceless developer." She reached across the table, trying to grab my hand. I smoothly pulled my hand back, resting it in my lap. She grabbed the empty air, her fingers curling into a tight, frustrated fist. "I know you don't have much," Beatrice continued, her tone shifting into a sickening, maternal wheedle that she had never, ever used with me before. "We know you're just an engineer, living in an apartment, but you must have some savings, a retirement fund you can borrow against. Maybe you could co-sign a high-risk personal loan for us. With your clean credit history, we could secure $100,000 by this afternoon. It would buy us enough time to restructure." I stared at her, utterly fascinated by the sheer, staggering audacity of the request. She wanted me to ruin my financial future, to chain myself to her sinking ship, simply because we shared a bloodline. "You want me to take out a loan," I said slowly, ensuring every word was perfectly enunciated, "to pay for the legal fees of an estate that you explicitly banned me from entering." Chloe finally snapped. The pressure in her chest broke, and the terrified girl vanished, replaced once again by the vicious, entitled brat I had known my entire life. "Oh my God, Mom, stop begging her," Chloe practically screamed, slamming her hands on the table. A few people in the coffee shop turned to look at us, but Chloe didn't care. Her face was flushed an ugly, splotchy red. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Look at her, she's sitting there gloating. She loves this. She always hated us because we were real Sterlings, and she was just a charity case." "Chloe, shut up," Beatrice hissed, terrified of alienating her last lifeline. "No," Chloe yelled, tears of rage finally spilling over her eyelashes. "It's all Grandpa's fault. If he hadn't been so stupid, if he had just left you some actual money instead of that worthless piece of junk watch, you could actually help us right now. But he screwed us all. He gave us a house that costs $1 million a year just to keep the lights on, and he gave his favorite little mechanic a piece of literal garbage. If you had money, we wouldn't be in this mess. The air in the booth went completely still. The ambient noise of the coffee shop, the grinding of espresso beans, the murmur of conversation, the jazz music on the overhead speakers, seemed to fade away into absolute silence. I looked at Chloe, I looked at Beatrice, the trap had closed, the mainspring had fully unwound. It was time. I reached into the inner pocket of my cashmere sweater. I didn't pull out my wallet. I pulled out a sleek, heavy, matte black metal card. It was an American Express Centurion card, issued strictly by invitation to clients with 8-figure liquid assets. I placed it gently on the table, right between Beatrice's trembling hands and Chloe's clenched fists. The heavy metal made a sharp, distinct clack against the faux wood. Beatrice stopped breathing. Her eyes dropped to the card. She knew what it was. She had spent her entire life chasing the kind of wealth that card represented, and she had never once held one in her own name. "What? What is that?" Beatrice whispered, the blood completely draining from her face. "That," I said quietly, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the table, "is the punchline to the joke you all laughed at 2 years ago." Chloe stared at the card, confusion warring with the blind rage in her eyes. "I don't understand. Is that a fake? Where did you get a black card?" "I got it," I replied, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing with the finality of a gavel striking a judge's block. "From the primary account linked to a highly secure, offshore trust fund based in Geneva. A trust fund entirely outside the jurisdiction of U.S. probate courts. A trust fund that currently holds $22.4 million. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization. "Grandpa didn't give me a broken watch, Chloe," I said, turning my gaze to my cousin. "He gave me a custom-engineered mechanical puzzle box. And inside that box were the cryptographic keys to his actual life's work. The money he spent decades hiding from you." "No," Beatrice whimpered, shaking her head violently, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "No, that's impossible. Vance read the will, we got the estate, we got the companies, the holding accounts." "You got the bait," I interrupted, quoting the note that was currently sitting safely in my loft. "He explicitly told me. He said you were defective gears. He knew that if he cut you out, you would contest the will and drag me through hell for a decade. So, he gave you exactly what you wanted. He gave you the vanity. He gave you the massive, sinking ships. The over-leveraged commercial real estate, the unsellable Italian vineyard, the dilapidated manor with the failing foundation. He handed you the anvils, and he watched from the grave as you tied them around your own necks. You knew," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking, the hatred evaporating into absolute, paralyzing horror. "You knew this whole time. You watched me run out of money. You watched Uncle Richard go bankrupt." "I practiced malicious compliance," I corrected her softly. "You told me to stay out of your lives. You told me the gravy train had derailed. I simply respected your wishes as the new heads of the Sterling family." "Ellie, please," Beatrice openly sobbed now, abandoning all pride, all dignity. She reached out and desperately clawed at my sleeve. "If you have that money, you can save us, you can pay off the bank, you can buy the manor back, it's your grandfather's house, you grew up there, you can't let it go to a developer. Please, I'm begging you, we will pay you back, we will do whatever you want." I looked down at her hand clutching my cashmere sleeve. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering anger. Just a profound, quiet emptiness where my family used to be. "You're right about one thing, Beatrice," I said, gently but firmly prying her fingers off my arm. "I am going to save the manor." I picked up the black card and slid it back into my pocket. "But I'm not doing it for you, and I'm certainly not paying off your debts. You are going to go to the foreclosure auction today. You are going to stand on the courthouse steps, and you are going to watch the bank officially strip the Sterling name from that deed. And then, you are going to figure out how to live in the real world, just like you told me I would have to." I stood up from the booth. I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my pocket and dropped it on the table. "The coffees are on me," I said. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, the bell chiming cheerfully above me. As I stepped out into the freezing rain, I didn't look back through the window. I didn't need to. The chapter was closed. The foreclosure auction took place at noon on the steps of the municipal courthouse. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city under a heavy, bruised sky. I didn't attend in person. I sat in the back of a rented, heavily tinted black town car, parked halfway down the block, watching the proceedings through the window. Evelyn Cross stood on the steps, representing a newly formed, anonymous LLC that I legally controlled. She looked immaculate, a shark in a tailored gray suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. There were a few other bidders, representatives from commercial development firms looking to gut the property and subdivide the acreage into luxury condos. And standing off to the side, huddled together in the damp cold, were Beatrice and Chloe. They looked like ghosts haunting their own funeral. The auctioneer, a bored-looking county official, read the terms of the default and opened the bidding. The developers threw out lowball numbers, well aware of the massive structural liabilities the manor carried. Evelyn countered smoothly, her voice carrying over the plaza. The bidding war was incredibly brief. The developers reached their risk threshold and backed out within 5 minutes. Going once, the auctioneer called out. Going twice. Sold, to the representative for Ethelgard Holdings, LLC. Evelyn walked forward to sign the preliminary paperwork. In the town car, I let out a long, slow breath. The tension completely left my body. We had bought the massive, sprawling Sterling estate, the land, the garages, and the greenhouse, for roughly 20 cents on the dollar of its original appraised value. Beatrice and Chloe watched Evelyn sign the papers, completely unaware that the anonymous LLC was mine. When the auction was over, Beatrice slumped against a stone pillar, burying her face in her hands. Chloe just stared blankly at the street. My driver looked at me through the rearview mirror. Where to, Miss Sterling? Home, Marcus, I said softly. Take me home. 6 months later, the air in the grand foyer of the manor smelled faintly of lemon oil and fresh sawdust. The horrific matte white paint that Chloe had plastered over the Brazilian mahogany in the library had been painstakingly stripped away by a team of master restorers, revealing the warm, rich grain beneath. The cheap laminate flooring was gone, replaced by the original, refinished hardwood. The foundation had been heavily reinforced, the plumbing entirely modernized. I had spent $2 million on the renovations, and it was worth every single penny. But my favorite part of the estate was in the back. The greenhouse had been entirely rebuilt. The glass roof was immaculate, letting in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun. The walls were lined with hundreds of ticking clocks, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that made the air feel alive. I sat at my grandfather's old, heavy oak workbench. I was wearing my oversized flannel shirt, my hair tied back in a messy knot with a rubber band. I was currently working on a highly complex 19th-century marine chronometer for a museum in London. I hadn't heard from Beatrice or Chloe since the day at the coffee shop. Through Evelyn's discreet channels, I learned that they had eventually declared total bankruptcy. They were living in a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a deeply unglamorous suburb. Beatrice was working as a receptionist at a mid-tier dental clinic. Chloe had tried to pivot her social media to a bankruptcy survival aesthetic, but her audience, accustomed to extreme wealth, quickly abandoned her. Uncle Richard was still MIA, presumably hiding from international creditors. They were surviving. They were finally learning the value of a dollar, the weight of consequence, and the reality of a world that didn't care about their last name. I picked up my tweezers and delicately placed the final jewel bearing into the escapement of the chronometer. I gently nudged the balance wheel. It sprang to life, a rapid, perfect, rhythmic ticking. If you put the right gear in the right place, the universe makes sense. It ticks, it beats, it lives. I smiled, lowering my tools. I reached over to the corner of the velvet mat, where a small, custom-made glass display case rested. Inside the case, sitting proudly on a pedestal of black velvet, was the heavily tarnished, rusted, fractured brass pocket watch. It was ugly. It was broken. It was a piece of junk. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever owned. My cell phone, resting on the opposite end of the desk, lit up silently. A notification popped onto the screen, a blocked number attempting to leave a voicemail. The screen glowed for a few seconds, then faded back to black. I didn't even read the caller ID. I just turned back to my workbench, adjusted my loop, and let the steady, comforting ticking of 100 perfect machines wash over me, safe in the knowledge that I had finally, truly, learned the value of time.